Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, as well as members of the general public concerned about monopolies and data privacy and curious to learn more. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law section, and is part of our ongoing series demystifying some of the economics terminology that gets bandied about in antitrust. This series examines the various economic tests, tools, and analytical models that enforcers use to evaluate whether a merger is bad for competition and should be stopped. Today's episode is on the critical loss analysis. Joining me today is my co-host, Scheele, a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, previously served for almost 27 years in the U.S. Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Anant. Thanks for having me here today.
Scott, who do we have on the show today?
Anant, we have Ron Drennan. He joins us from the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. In Ron's 25 years of the division, he has served several roles, including staff economist, section chief, acting director, and his current role as economic advisor. He's worked on several litigated matters, including some with me, covering various industries, including health insurance, software, airlines, and consumer products.
Great. Why don't you take it away?
So, Ron, before we get started, I understand you have a disclaimer.
Yes, and first of all, thanks again for inviting me, Scott and Anant, to join you guys today. So, the views I express are all my own and not purported to reflect those of the Department of Justice.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So, why don't we get started with the most foundational basic question: what is critical loss at a high level?
Sure. At its most basic level and its most common form, critical loss is a concept that asks what must be true for a certain price increase to be profitable, period.
Okay, well, can you elaborate on that a bit, maybe with an example?
Sure. Suppose I run a business and I sell a single product. If I raise the price of my product by a small amount, then that price increase is going to have two consequences, right, that work in opposite directions. Specifically, it will give me a greater profit margin, but it's also going to result in fewer sales. So the first consequence is helpful to my profits. For every customer that continues purchasing my product at the higher price, my profits go up, right? Because on all those units sold, I now have a bigger spread between the price I receive and the costs I incurred to make and sell those units. The second consequence goes in the opposite directions and hurts my profits. Higher prices will generally result in my business making fewer sales. You always hear economists talk about downward sloping demand. Price goes up, quantity goes down. So as some customers now would have bought my product at the initial lower price, some of them are going to balk at the higher price and they won't buy as much as they otherwise would have. So I lose profits on any such foregone sales from the reduction in quantity. Now, whether the price change was a good idea or not, whether the price change on net increases or decreases my profits, well, that depends on the net effect of these two opposing consequences. Critical loss, what it does is it identifies the dividing line between a positive or negative net effect on profits. It asks, what is the degree of customer response that separates a profitable price increase from an unprofitable price increase?
Okay, thanks. So can you explain how and where critical loss is used as a tool in merger analysis?
Sure. It's been presented by experts in antitrust litigation, and it's been used by courts to define markets primarily. It can also be used to evaluate competitive effects, but I don't think we'll have time to get into that today. But even if we just stick within its use in market definition, we can still discuss a fair amount of the debate that's surrounding this tool and its use in antitrust.
And so if we're talking just about using critical loss in market definition, does that mean it would be applied in the same way each time?
No. The concept can be applied in various ways. I think it's helpful to break that down and focus our discussion today on the application of critical loss into two different categories, which describe the ways that I see it used most often, both of which are break-even concepts. The first category of use is the original application, which was described in an article by Harris and Simons back in 1989, and which envisioned a uniform price increase applied broadly across all the products at issue, or the full scope of the product at issue. The second type of application would be to consider a narrower price increase on as few as a single product out of a larger group. So, for example, suppose we're looking at differentiated products sold to consumers with different brands. You might look at the price increase of a single brand of that product rather than an increase that applies across all brands within that product group.
Oh, that's helpful, Ron. Thanks. So what information do you as an economist need in order to do a critical loss analysis?
So part of the appeal of critical loss is its simplicity. In order to calculate the threshold that it generates, it involves simply taking information about profitability and using that to calculate a benchmark against, and then what you do with that benchmark is then you compare that benchmark to various pieces of evidence you can find that relate to how customers would react to a specified price increase. So to calculate the benchmark, or to calculate the critical loss, I need only the product's contribution margin and the percentage price increase that we wish to contemplate. So the formula you use to calculate it is a ratio. It's the price increase divided by the sum of the price increase plus contribution margin. So to see how it works, we'll start with the original application, a uniform price increase, and let's make up some numbers. Suppose we consider a 10% price increase by a seller who earns a 20% contribution margin on the sale of a single product.
Could you hold a second, Ron? You keep talking, you mentioned a couple times contribution margin. Could you tell us what that means in English?
Sure. Contribution margin is a specific type of profit margin, one that focuses on how those last incremental units of sale contributed to profits. So suppose I have a lemonade stand. That's my business, and I charge $1 per glass. All right. And I think about how my profits might differ between whether I sell 100 cups of lemonade or 90 cups of lemonade. Well, those extra 10 cups sold, numbers 91 through 100 at $1 a piece, brought in an extra $10 in revenue for me, right? But to make those 10 extra cups, I needed to use more lemon, more sugar, more water, and more plastic cups, right? So if all of those incremental expenses, those marginal costs, added up to, let's say, $8, then we would say those last 10 sales contributed $2 to my profits, 10 minus the 8, $2 to my profits. And this incremental profit of $2 represents a 20% of the incremental revenue. It's the $2 profit is 20% of that last $10 of revenue. So we would say contribution margin is 20% in this case. Notice that to come up to calculate this concept, I ignored other costs, what economists call fixed costs, that did not change based on whether I sold 90 or 100 cups. So for example, I didn't take into account how much I spent on the wood I used to build the lemonade stand.
Oh, that's helpful.
And Ron, as a layperson, I sort of use margin and profit synonymously, but contribution margin is not the same thing as just your overall profit margin here. This is sort of the margin of the last few units of sale.
Yes, it focuses on sort of the last few units of sale or the next few units of sale. So there's lots of concepts of profits, including, you've heard like EBITDA or whatever, and are you taking account of, depreciation of some fixed asset or something. So this focuses just on modest incremental change. So.
Thanks.
So that's helpful, Ron. So now that we know what critical loss is, how would we apply this broad product application or version of critical loss?
Sure. So you plug the numbers into the formula, and if the seller raises the price of its product by 10% and the 20%, then that 20% margin, contribution margin, implies a critical loss threshold of 1/3. How did I get 1/3? It's the 10 divided by the sum of 10 plus 20, or 10 over 30, or 1/3, right? So, all right, what does that mean? In the context of a uniform price increase, this threshold of 1/3 means that the 10% price increase we're thinking about would increase profits unless the seller loses 1/3 or more of its sales due to the price increase. And then, so now what you want to do is you look at the evidence on how many sales the seller would expect to lose or be predicted to lose. And as a result of the 10% price increase, and you compare that predicted loss to this critical loss threshold of 1/3. And the evidence that you might use to do that could vary from case to case. Maybe you have data or documents or, industry testimony.
So Ron, you mentioned earlier that critical loss can be used in market definition. How is it used in market?
So I see it being used as one way to apply the hypothetical monopolist test, or HMT, that is set forth in the merger guidelines.
Now, I believe the merger guidelines describe the hypothetical monopolist test as asking whether a hypothetical monopolist of a group of products would likely undertake at least a snip on at least one product in a group. Is that right?
Yes. We're focused here on the price increase version of the SNP. So now think about
by SNP, you mean a small but significant non-transitory increase in price, right?
Yes, easy for you to say. Yes, exactly.
Fair enough.
So now think about that phrase that you mentioned near the end of that original text that you read. The phrase I have in mind is for at least one product in the group. This phrase is in the 2023 guidelines. It was also in the 2010 guidelines. So at least one, right, covers a range of possibilities. It means you can contemplate a price increase as narrow as a single product. Again, in some cases, this might mean increasing the price of a single brand. But at least one also includes a broad price increase, including one that applies to all the products controlled by the hypothetical monopolist. So remember earlier, I mentioned there were two categories of how critical loss might be applied that we wanted to talk about. So the first category was in the context of the broad price increase, the original implementation, the original envisionment of it. And the second category is in the context of a narrow price increase. So this numeric example that I'm walking you through now is an example of how to implement critical loss in the context of the broad price increase, that first critical loss category that I talked about, such as an increase in the price of all products sold by the hypothetical monopolist. So getting back to that numeric example with the 20% margin, if the evidence suggests that a 10% increase in the price of all products sold by the hypothetical monopolist would lead the quantity sold by that monopolist to drop by less than a third, then critical loss tells us the price increase would be profitable. Knowing that a 10% price increase would be profitable can indicate that a profit maximizing seller would raise price by at least a snip, favorite term, that is consistent with a properly defined relevant market.
Ron, isn't that the way the FTC used critical loss in the Tronox Crystal case?
Yes, exactly. The Tronox Crystal case that the FTC brought in 2018 is one such example here, in which the FTC's economic expert presented critical loss in the context of market definition, which was one of the key questions in that case. The FTC, without getting into too much detail, the FTC said the relevant product market was as narrow as a certain type of titanium oxide. The defendant argued relevant market was not only geographically larger, but also included a second type of titanium oxide. The critical loss threshold calculated by the FTC's expert identified that the amount of sales that a hypothetical monopolist of the FTC's proposed market would have to lose in order to make that price increase unprofitable. He then compared this threshold to various pieces of evidence that implied in response to the 10% price increase, the reduction in sales would be less than that threshold amount that he calculated. And so the hypothetical monopolist price increase was found to be profitable. The court opinion notes this result by the expert was consistent with and bolstered other evidence suggesting the market could exclude this second type of titanium oxide that the defendants argued should have been in the market.
Well, since critical loss has been accepted by a court, does that mean there is no controversy or debate over its usefulness as a tool?
No. Critical loss, look, it's a simple tool. right? Its simplicity can be a plus in some ways, but it also comes with limitations. It identifies a threshold for a specific question in a simple setting. When I see it used, it's one piece of a broader analysis. The quality of the full analysis that incorporates it will also depend on several other factors, including quality, relevance, reliability of the information that you're marshaling to describe what consumers would actually do in response to a contemplated price increase.
Well, Ron, the devil is always in the assumptions for an economist, isn't it?
Fair enough. Point taken.
Well, I think
Exactly.
the use of critical loss in DOJ's case against SunGard and Comdisco went so well for the DOJ. Could you talk about that?
Correct. It did not. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So the application and DOJ's failed attempt to block the merger of SunGard Comdisco in 2001 highlights what I think is an important aspect of the debate surrounding how critical loss has sometimes been used. So in that case, the court determined that the government had not met its burden of establishing that a relevant product market was limited to something called shared hot site services, the government's proposed market, at the exclusion of other types of options for customers, such as internal hot sites or quick ship services. The court cited a lack of clarity in the evidence of customer preferences. So just so you know, what we're talking about here is the types of solutions an enterprise would turn to in response to interruption in their computer systems. And so shared hot site services, the government's proposed market, was one such solution to that problem. Now, the contribution margin associated with providing these shared services at the heart of the government's case to one additional customer, the contribution margin, was very, very high. When margins are very high, the threshold for substitution generated by the critical loss formula is quite low. And so when there's not great quantitative evidence on the price elasticity of demand for the product, it might be easy for one to adopt the thinking that, well, surely at least some small percentage of customers are going to stop purchasing this product in response to a price increase. And so following that line of thought, nearly any proposed market might fail to meet the test when margins are so high, because, as was argued in that case, a firm maybe couldn't take the risk of raising prices and risking, losing sales with those high margins. And that was argued in court. And so what you saw from that was a big response from the academic literature in reaction to that case. And some economists, including Katz and Shapiro, pointed out that economics tells us that when contribution margins are high, price elasticity is likely to be low, meaning that customers are likely not very sensitive to modest changes in price, and that it is unlikely many sales would be lost due to a small price increase when margins are high.
Well, that insight, Ron, the insight that high contribution margins suggest low price elasticity, that seems important. Has anyone found a way to incorporate that insight into critical loss analysis?
Yes. The same Katz and Shapiro article I was talking about in 2003 went on to articulate a way to leverage the information about elasticity that one can often infer from contribution margins. And that led to their development of what I mentioned earlier was the second way to apply critical loss analysis, and that's in the context of a narrower price increase. So the article demonstrates that the threshold you calculate via the critical loss formula also has relevance to the profitability of raising the price of a single product within a larger group of commonly owned products.
And is this other way, the way you characterize as involving a narrower price increase, is that also relevant to the hypothetical monopolist test?
Yeah, it is. Recall that phrase in the merger guidelines we discussed and that I highlighted, that the HMT considers a snip on at least one product in the group. HMT, hypothetical monopolist test, considers a snip on at least one product in the group. So imagine you have a hypothetical monopolist over a group of substitute products, and you contemplate that monopolist raising the price of only one of those products. You plug in the margin and the contemplated price increase into the formula, and it spits out a threshold number as it did before. But what you do with that number is different in the case of a narrow price increase than in the case of a broad price increase.
Okay, so that's helpful, but it seems a little abstract. Can you give us an example of a scenario in which you might use the narrower approach?
Sure. Suppose you're evaluating a merger of two companies that only sell bars of hand soap. let's say the firm that makes Ivory soap is merging with the firm that sells Irish Spring. And to keep things simple, let's say that these are the only products each of these firms makes. In evaluating that merger, you may wish to ask whether a relevant antitrust market, in this case, might be limited to just bars of hand soap. Exclude other functional substitutes like liquid soap. So you may want to test, if that's the case, you may want to test whether a hypothetical monopolist of all bars of hand soap likely would undertake a snip on just one brand of bar soap if it did not change the price of the other brands in the proposed market. So for simplicity, let's say there's only one other brand, Dove, which is sold by a non-merging firm. So we have a market in our example with just 3 brands, Ivory, Irish Spring, and Dove. Okay, so it would indicate, if it can be shown, that a hypothetical monopolist of all the brands in the market, in our case, these 3 brands, would undertake a single brand snip. That finding can help establish a market can be limited to just bar soap. Such a finding would indicate that other brands in the market collectively provide so much competitive discipline on the focal product, Ivory, that eliminating just that competition would lead to a price increase despite the presence of any other substitutes that might exist outside the proposed market. So, and such a finding could help establish that, say, as I said, liquid soap could be excluded from the relevant market.
Okay. Can we see how this version in the example you're talking about, how would that play out using the same numbers you were using before?
Got it. Right. So we'll continue using 10% our price increase, 20% our margin. And as we remember from before, those 2 inputs means it generates a critical loss threshold of 1/3, right? So all that stays the same. So this second type of application of critical loss can inform whether this market would pass the narrow snip version of the HMT by helping us evaluate whether increasing the price of just the Ivory brand by 10% would increase or decrease the profits that our hypothetical monopolist earns across all 3 brands combined. Because we are looking at a narrow price increase on just a subset of our product group, of our product market, the 1/3 is now a threshold for how many sales lost by Ivory soap are diverted to the other brands within this group, within our proposed market, specifically to Dove and Irish Spring. So with these numbers, a 10% increase in the price of Ivory soap, the subject of the snip, is profitable for the hypothetical monopolist if at least 1/3 of the lost sales from Ivory are recaptured by Dove and Irish Spring, the monopolist's other products. And if that's the case, then that can support excluding, say, liquid soap from the market.
Okay. Let me make sure I follow this. It sounds like the critical loss threshold can sometimes be a ceiling and sometimes be a floor. In the first case, the broader application of critical loss, when the price of everything the monopolist sold went up by 10%, it passes the hypothetical monopolist test, meaning the critical loss analysis suggests there's a relevant market. If substitution away from the full set of products was no greater than the ceiling of 1/3. But now you're also saying that if we're increasing the price of only one product within a larger group of products, that is, if we're doing a narrow application of the critical loss analysis, the market passes the hypothetical monopolist test, meaning that the critical loss analysis suggests there is a relevant market. If substitution within the set of products controlled by the hypothetical monopolist is at least as high as the floor of 1/3. Have I got that right?
Yeah, excellent summary. For a broad price increase, profits go up if substitution away is less than the threshold. For a narrow price increase, the seller's profits go up if substitution to profits within the market is more than this threshold. Good.
You're just saying it's excellent summary because you wrote it for me. So Ron, is there a name for this substitution among products within the market?
Yes, that's known as aggregate diversion ratio, or ADR. It's also sometimes referred to as a recapture rate.
Okay, so now I'm pretty sure I know at least one case where critical loss has been used in this way, in conjunction with ADR and a narrow price increase. A case that is near and dear to both of our hearts, Ron, because we were slugging it out in the trenches on this one, H&R Block TaxAct. Could you tell us a little bit about that
Yes.
one?
Sure. Good times, Scott. Good times. So for those who were not so lucky as to be in those trenches, this case that we worked on it was a case brought by DOJ in 2011. In that case, DOJ's proposed market was digital do-it-yourself tax prep software, or digital DIY tax prep software. People are most familiar with TurboTax product. That's something, if you say TurboTax, most people know what that is. Well, so think about that type of product. And at the time, H&R Block and TaxAct sold the second and third most popular versions of that product. So what happened in that trial? The DOJ's economic expert, found that the aggregate diversion ratio from, for example, H&R Block product to the other products within the proposed market for tax prep software was well above the critical loss threshold, indicating that DOJ's proposed digital DIY market passed the hypothetical monopolist test. So it was the implementation of a narrow product SNP, right, for a monopolist that owned multiple brands. And it was one way of demonstrating that substitution among the products in the market, and thus demonstrating that the competitive constraints imposed by just the other in-market products was sufficiently high that other out-of-market options for customers, like going in person to an actual accountant, could be properly excluded from the market.
So in this example, the in-person accountant is equivalent to the liquid soap that you used in your earlier explanation.
Yes, exactly. It is something that is a functional substitute, right? The problem you're trying to solve with tax prep software can be solved, filling a return can be solved by going to an accountant for a lot more money. And so the question was, is just the competition among the software products enough that it can form a market?
So Ron, since was used in the H&R Block case so successfully, has there been any criticism of using critical loss in this way since then?
So yeah, there was an article that I saw criticizing the application in the H&R Block case.
Say it isn't so.
As I read, I know, but seriously, as I read that article, the criticism is really about the at least one product phrase in the hypothetical monopolist test, rather than the critical loss tool itself. And pointing to what's happened since, other courts after H&R Block have continued to accept this approach. And those courts at least do not seem troubled by the version of the hypothetical monopolist test that applies the SNP to just a single product. Aetna Humana is a case DOJ filed in 2016. That was one of those cases. The government's expert used critical loss and ADR analysis as one pillar of the overall work supporting DOJ's proposed market. Just like in the H&R Block case, the government's expert also supported their market definition in other ways, with other types of evidence than just critical loss analysis, including merger simulation was used, as well as documents and inferences from the documentary evidence. But critical loss with ADR was definitely among the pillars of supporting evidence. And there's other cases as well. If we look to our sister agency, FTC, they had a 2018 case against Wilhelmsen in which an implementation of critical loss involving aggregate diversion ratios was cited as support for the market definition in that case.
Ron, there's a lot of case law suggesting that market definition is all about or a lot about cross-price elasticity, but you really haven't mentioned that term talking about critical loss. How does cross-price elasticity come into play, if at all?
A very good question. Cross-price elasticity captures an aspect of how customers respond to a price change by shifting purchases between different goods, which is, in my mind, what analysis involving critical loss considers. And so I believe it has that concept embedded in it. For example, let's go back to our discussion of the hypothetical soap merger. The rate at which Irish Spring increases its sales in response to a price increase of its rival Ivory Soap, its pre-merger rival Ivory Soap, that rate is known as the cross-price elasticity from Ivory Soap to Irish Spring. And so the aggregate diversion ratio from Ivory to the other two brands, Irish Spring and Dove, in our hypothetical monopoly market are determined by the cross-price elasticities between these products. And the ADR presents that information about cross-price elasticity. It just presents it in a certain way. It presents it relative to the rate at which Ivory brand loses its sales. So yes, this is all consistent with the notion of determining markets according to cross-price elasticity.
I see. So is there any value in having these two different approaches or ways to implement critical loss?
Yes, absolutely. Antitrust analysis needs to be flexible. The set of tools that are valuable to use and helpful depend on the specific circumstances of the case at hand, the realities of the market, and what evidence happens to be available in any given case. So yes, it's very valuable to have the flexibility that these two ways provide.
That's great, Ron. So seems like we now know everything there is to know about critical loss, right?
No, definitely not everything. Look, when you actually implement critical loss in practice, the practitioner will have to think through several issues, including, and we're just not going to have time to go into that today, but just to give you a flavor, for example, think about case by case, what are the proper inputs and evidence to consider. My discussion today focused on break-even critical loss, as used in these two different types of circumstances I characterized, and which I think are the most common uses of the most common form that I've seen employed. But there are other relevant concepts and scenarios out there. There are competitive effects applications, like I mentioned, that we didn't cover. Also, there's a whole nother discussion someone could have about exactly how this break-even tool informs questions relating to profit maximizing behavior. Some related to that is the notion of critical elasticity. That's a concept Greg Gordon wrote about, among others, some time ago. So there are plenty of issues and considerations beyond what we discussed today.
Yeah, Ron, what are the key takeaways here for practitioners?
I'll offer 4 to walk away with. Takeaway number 1, I would say, is recognize the simplicity of the tool, which does allow us to employ it with only a few inputs. So that's good. But it also comes with limitations. Look, it's not going to explain why pre-merger prices are where they are, but rather it will identify a threshold response that would allow a specific price increase to be profitable. Takeaway number 2, I think it's important to appreciate the relationship that tends to exist between margins and elasticity. Recall our discussion that high margins often imply a low elasticity. It's a good thing to keep in mind. Takeaway number 3, my hope is that the listener to this comes away cognizant of the difference between using critical loss to contemplate a narrow price increase and a broad price increase. These are two different ways to use the tool, and which of those two ways is more relevant in any given case. It just may depend on the situation and information available. It can be influenced by whether the product at issue is differentiated or a commodity, for example. And finally, takeaway number 4, I think it's good to know that critical loss has been accepted by courts in various settings as a tool to help define markets. And it's been mentioned in the merger guidelines since 2010. So while merger analysis certainly does not require one to use critical loss, I expect it will continue to be used as one tool within the context of broader analyses in antitrust, especially with regards to market definition.
Well, thank you, Scott and Ron, for enlightening us on how enforcers use critical loss to gauge the potential impact of mergers. To our listeners, if you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to catch other episodes in this series where we take a close look at diversions, the Guppy test, vertical math, merger simulation, and bargaining law. As always, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.